breaking news out of New York. According to sources familiar with the matter, lawyers for Luigi Mangione have explored a plea deal for their client in the federal case against him. Now, prosecutors allege Mangione fatally shot the CEO of United Healthcare back in December 2024 in Manhattan. And right now, he's facing both federal and state charges. He's pleaded not guilty to all of them, and a state trial is set to start in September. Now, in a statement, his lawyers responding to those unnamed sources saying this is all part of a troubling, deliberate pattern by prosecutors and law enforcement to prejudice Luigi, manipulate public opinion, and violate his constitutional right to a fair trial and an impartial jury. Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Misty Marris. Misty, okay, so hypothetically speaking, I guess, what could a plea deal look like for Mangione? Is this surprising?
Well, you know, it's common for defense attorneys to approach a prosecutor and say, is there any way we could strike up a plea deal? And then prosecutors would say, you know, here's what we can offer. But what would it look like? You know, we have 2 charges of interstate stalking, which ultimately resulted in death. That is a potential life sentence if Luigi Mangione is convicted. So any plea deal would either have to be agreeing to plead guilty to maybe one or both of those charges or a lesser charge, with prosecutors agreeing to recommend a lesser sentence, and then ultimately the judge would have to approve it. You know, what that looks like, really unclear. How much federal prosecutors, again, this is the federal case, would be willing to recommend, how much of a haircut they would go in and say would be the appropriate sentence, even with a plea deal, remains a question. And that would really dictate whether or not the defense would ultimately go for it. What benefit would they derive?
And if this is happening in the federal case, if this plea deal has been brought up in the federal case, could we assume that maybe it would be also brought up in the state case? Because if you do one and you don't do the other, what's the point, right?
Yeah, so Gadi, I think that's twofold here, because first, if the federal case were to be resolved through a plea, the defense could make the argument that double jeopardy is triggered, because double jeopardy under the federal law is pretty narrow. There's different rules. Under New York State, it's much more broad. So if he pleads guilty to these federal crimes and then says, well, look, you cannot prosecute us in a New York State court. You can't prosecute Luigi Mangione because he has pled guilty for a crime that occurred as the same transaction for what he's charged with in New York. They potentially have an argument. They could fight that. But, Gadi, I want to remind you and the viewers, remember last week when Luigi Mangione's defense team said they were potentially raising this emotional distress type of argument in state court. Well, that's not a defense that can be raised in federal court. So if they were to plead guilty on the federal charges, well, that would pave the way and open up for that extreme emotional disturbance defense at the state level charges. So there's a lot of legal maneuvering going on here.
A lot of bobbing, a lot of weaving. NBC's Misty Marris, I really appreciate you. Thank you.